Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first in a series of talks hosted by the Department of Political Economy at King's College London and the Centre for British Politics and Government. I'm Rod Dacomb. I'm chairing the session on the Citizens' Convention on UK democracy and the prospects it raises for deliberative democracy in the UK. We're going to be hearing from three expert speakers today. Graham Allen, who many of you will know served for many years as an MP and is now visiting professor in DPE and perhaps the leading figure on the Citizens' Convention and its prospects. Then Kerry Davies, who is the director of the Centre for Deliberative Research at the National Centre for Social Research. And then finally, Marta Wojciechowkska, who is a research associate in DPE, who specialises in deliberation. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we begin. We'll have a short talk from each of our speakers, followed by a period of time where we'll get much more interactive and open things up for questions. You'll ask a question by typing them in and we'll pick them up and I'll repeat them through. We'll be able to get through most, if not all, of the questions that we have, but apologies if we don't. If you have an urgent question or something you'd like clarified on the back of something one of the speakers says, please indicate so when you ask it, and we'll have a very short opportunity to ask them at the end of each talk. Otherwise, we'll leave them for discussion at the end. When you ask a question, if you could say who you are, and if the question is directed to a particular speaker, that would be really good as well. So, before we begin, we're going to have a very short introduction from Andrew Blick, who is the head of the Department of Political Economy and has been very closely involved in driving forward the Citizens' Convention. Andrew, over to you.
Thank you, Rod. Really pleased to be introducing this today. I am now head of the Department of Political Economy. I've been in that role since August, but before that, and still closely involved now, I hope, I was heading up the academic end, this project on the Citizens' Convention for UK democracy. We were very grateful for the funding we got from both the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust and the Joseph Rowntree Reform Trust, true to form, supporting democratic innovation where others might not. So I know there are many projects out there over time, including some I've been involved in, which wouldn't have happened without their support. So I'd like to put that on the record. We're very grateful for that. This is a project myself and, as was mentioned, Graham Allen, who was an MP for many years. For a short number of those years, I actually worked for him as well. But we've been working on various things over the years. And when Graham was chair of the Political and Constitutional Reform Committee in the House of Commons from 2010 to 2015, we worked on a project looking at whether or not the UK should adopt a written constitution. I expect Graham may talk about some of this, but just to say that was in some ways a first stage towards thinking about if you're going to introduce constitutional change, there we go, and you can see the thing there from my assistant holding up the report. But one of the things we began to think about was how do you actually. It's one thing to have a big report like the one you just saw there, but how do you get there in a way that's legitimate? What's the process by which you reach that kind of an outcome? We can all talk about what outcomes we'd like, but which is all very interesting and important. But the other question is, how do you get there, and how do you actually involve the people, however defined, in reaching that outcome? And I think that's one of the things we're talking about today. And in recent years, there's been a lot of thought about innovative ways of doing that, and some of these ideas go back a long way to the very beginning of democracy, but nevertheless there's been a lot of work going on, a lot of development around the world, including in the UK, around this idea of whether you can actually involve what might be defined patronising as ordinary members of the public in actual deliberation processes, and how you can help them to come to informed and reasoned decisions about processes that affect them. So that's what we're really talking about today. And I've been asked to kind of flag up 2 questions that I think are important in relation to this subject. So there are many questions that are important, but I think one interesting one is, why do we need it now? Why is it important right now in the situation we're in now? And then the other one being, I think is important, how do we get a government to buy into this? Because I think when we talk about these kind of processes, one thing that's really important is that people feel like what they're doing actually connects up to something in the real world. That it's great to have a discussion, have a talk, have a chat, but also does it lead on to something in the real world? Well, the only way you can really achieve that is by somehow bringing on board those who govern us, those in positions of power within a representative democracy, to actually see a reason that they need to engage with this and at least take into account what the outputs are and what the proposals are that emerge from it. And that's a two-way process. On the one hand, we have to have a government that's willing to do it, but also we have to be realistic about what we can expect out the other end. I think those are two important things. So those are my two questions really: why now, and can we realistically expect a government to get on board for this, and if so, how? So I'll leave it there, but those are my opening thoughts. I'm really grateful to have everyone here taking part in this.
So I committed the cardinal sin that you're never supposed to do on Teams and Zoom meetings, which is to try and speak with my microphone muted. I promise I won't do that again. Okay. Thanks very much, Andrew. And you guys won't be able to see this, but I can. There are already some questions coming in, so that's fantastic. I think it's going to be a really good and interactive session. So before I waste any more time, I'm going to pass straight over to Graham Allen, who's going to give our first talk.
Great, thanks very much, Rod. And thank you, Andrew, and thank you while I'm here for all the effort that Kings have put in on this project, going back now over 10 years, and certainly picking up from 2015. It would not have been possible without Kings, so I really should say that up front. Andrew, two really significant questions, and I will try in my remarks to address those questions, but also just to acknowledge that we've got a global audience listening in at the moment. They'll be interested in what we're doing in the UK. Also, we've got a number of people who don't know about deliberation, so we're going to have to pitch our remarks at different levels at different times. So the people who know a lot about this and the people who don't know much, I hope you'll forgive us on those bits. We'll try and include everybody, but those bits where we leave you behind or get ahead of you. Firstly, I think, what is this all about? Why are we here, and what are we trying to achieve? And ultimately, we are trying to achieve a revitalization of democracy, which is under massive pressure. I won't go into all that. It's in the documentation that we've supplied to you ahead of the conversation this afternoon. And what we need to do is evolve our democracy so that it is fit for purpose over the next decades and possibly centuries ahead, because at the moment it doesn't do that. It doesn't fulfill the functions that a good democracy should. Now, traditionally, we've had people like the ones you see on the screen coming up, having put a wet towel over their head with a great sort of version of what the future should look like. The really big thing we're bringing to the party is that we now are using deliberative democracy. We're actually engaging with citizens. That is now possible. It's not just a theory, not just a methodology, although those things are important, but it is a how you get it done with citizens. And on that journey, we have to answer lots of questions that, frankly, I had when I was a member of Parliament who supported, in general, things like citizens' assemblies, citizens' juries. I didn't really believe at that point that it was central to what we're doing. But I've learned, it's only taken me 30 years as a member of Parliament to learn those lessons, but I finally learned them. And why is it important? It's because actually, unless we bring people with us, unless people trust the outcomes, they will not understand or be on the side of change. If they are themselves responsible for bringing that change forward to some degree and are involved in that process as well as others, then we've got a fighting chance of actually saving and revitalizing and reshaping our democracy. So the instrument that we decided to do to bring together that sort of philosophy, if you like, it emerges from lots of the work we did on the Select Committee on Political and Constitutional Reform, which I chaired. Andrew and his colleague, Professor Robert Blackburn, were in effect like the whole of King's were the special advisor to that select committee, which is why we were so prolific over that 5 years. But when that committee was wound up by the incoming majority Conservative government, probably felt there was nothing wrong with our politics and democracy, so why did we need the select committee? We carried on the work, and the biggest bit of unfinished business was about creating deliberative democracy, actually making it work practically. And in that intervening period, there has been an explosion of activity on deliberation across the globe. Jim Fishkin's done 110 deliberative polling exercises. Rod Dacon's been out on an estate in Oxford at the other level of that, producing fantastic work at a very local level. Miriam Levin pioneered 3 government-funded local experiments in Test Valley, Dudley and Cambridge. New South, gotta get my provinces right, I think it's regions right. South Australia, I think, did the big nuclear waste debate. South Korea changed its nuclear energy policy on the back of this. Germany, France, Belgium, everywhere you go across the world now, people are using deliberation, and they're doing it without the threat being felt by those who you and I elect to the positions. So one of the things I want to underline is so much about what we want to do is about trust. And one of the things about trust is that you can't criticize and undermine elected representatives and then expect them to deliver on your bit of work. You've got to treat elected representatives, and they have to treat citizens as partners and develop that sort of trust. It's not easy, but if you don't do that, then you're not going to get anywhere, because your deliberations will have no home. You'll have a load of reports like I've got in my flat here in London, which don't go anywhere other than collect a lot of dust. Some of them are beautiful. I contributed to some of them even, but it's a waste of space if you don't actually have an end game. So getting a political end game means ensuring that your partners and you work together, which is why when we've done this document, which is on the web link and has been sent to every participant, it's only 30 odd pages. If that's too much for you, we've got lots of nice pictures and graphics in it, by the way, but if that's too much, there's a 4-page summary, so have a look at that one too. If you like the talkies, there's Andrew and myself giving evidence just a couple of weeks ago at the Select Committee in the House of Commons to get Parliament again on our side as we talk to government on this. So everything is there, and what it says on the can is that this is a proposal from the Citizens Convention on UK Democracy. That's us and a massive board and group of experts, the best in the world, looking at this. It's their proposal, our proposal, to the British government for citizens' engagement in an institution which is just being set up by the government shortly, called a Commission on Constitution, Democracy and Rights. The reason this has evolved in the last year or so is because we were lucky enough to play a small part in getting all 4 UK-wide political parties to say something in their manifestos, and we quote them at the very front. You've got the Conservatives, Labour, Lib Dems, Green Party, who actually said something at the last election where they bound themselves to reviewing, in some respect, our democracy. That then gives us the opportunity to say, you can't have a review of democracy if you don't listen to citizens. That doesn't mean that you have to do everything that the citizens come up with. And that's the one big mistake I think that Monsieur Macron, in an otherwise brilliant pioneering effort on the Grand Debate in France, I think that's the mistake he made, because you can't actually give people a gift which is going to tie them to not do their job. Their job is to examine legislation, to examine law. So bring them in, let's work collectively, and that's what we intend to do. So what we will do here, and what this says and how we will do it, is start to engage with citizens once government has agreed that this is a sensible way forward, once government has agreed an agenda that's worthwhile and that they can live with, and once we have got from them a commitment on how they will handle this once it's done. Get your political endgame in place before you do your first ever meeting is a really big lesson for all of us. Don't spend a lot of time doing lovely reports if you've not yet found a home for it, if you've not yet got commitment from the right level of government. So that's where we've got to on this particular document that we've given to the Prime Minister last week to look at, and hopefully to come back and say, yeah, let's engage in that conversation. Now, the other really important thing is all the people you see on the screen have been policy people, including me. They're policy people. They write lovely stuff. I've read some lovely stuff from Andrew Blick and Rod Dacomb and Kerry Davis. Yet to read something from Marta because I've only just met her today, but I look forward to that too. But you know what? It again is a lesson learned that as well as great policy that can be written, you need to have process to get it through the sausage machine. How does it start out? What's in the middle? Where do we get to? What's the end game? When citizens have created this beautiful gift of a great report, what is the rest of the process? And I guess, you know, again, it takes me a long time to get round to these things, but I've now, in a sense, let Zen-like the policy stuff slip away from me and become the plumber and the engineer, because if the citizens are to do this honestly, if it's to have integrity, if it's to be trusted, they have to come up with the policies. Sadly, not me and not any of our colleagues that are on this call today. The citizens have to do that, and our job is to ensure that that work is respected and not wasted, but properly processed. And if we give that gift to our democracy, that will be an incredible step forward. I've mentioned about our relationship, again, probably the second big trust point after not policy, but process, the second big trust point, which is the partnership we need to develop between citizens and the elected representatives we have. So I won't go into that in detail, but just to say it's not as hard as you might think. Already, our elected representatives, 6 select committees banded together to create a climate change report, really superb report. That now needs to get the end game. In an ideal world, I would have suggested that came first, but look, we are where we are. The people involved in that have done a really good job, and that now needs to be progressed. Similarly, a couple of select committees, I think nearly 2 years ago now, came up with a unified policy on social care, where it was always a way of taking a lump out of the other side. It's become something where we can actually move forward together. That's been done by Parliament. So that story is repeated across the planet. So no one can say we're not, does it happen anywhere? Are people good enough? Are people bright enough to do this sort of stuff? And the other part of this is you take some of the most difficult issues. Don't take an issue when it's in crisis, when it's a desperation measure. Deliberation isn't a panacea. Take it when you see that there is a difficult problem. Ian Walker, who's a good friend of ours from New Democracy in Australia, says, I say to MPs, give us your hardest problem. Because if you take a group of citizens, they don't have whips in their legislature telling them what they got to do without even reading the documentation on a daily basis. They don't have the press getting on their case immediately and saying, why haven't you solved this? They're given the ability to do slow cooked politics, democracy in good conditions, as Jim Fishkin says, and they can take their time and come up with a good answer. And so parliamentarians or elected people say, this is great, because if we tried this, we would all fall out. The classic example is in Ireland, where Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael used to fall out over the issue of abortion, among many others. But because it was taken out of their hands, a group of Irish citizens came up with something that most people could actually live with. So give us your hardest problem, it can be done that way. And finally, on trust, you must make sure that your stuff is negotiable. It's not, you got to do it our way because we're experts. Oh, I wrote a big paper on it, I've written a book. Oh, right. You've got to get involved in some dirty politics. If you mean it, you've got to do that and say, how do we negotiate the things that we need to talk about, and how do we do that? Providing it is trusted and has integrity within the bubble of the Citizens' Convention, that's the thing to do. I think, Rod, I'm running out of time. Have I got 1 minute left? 2 minutes. Oh, right. Okay. So I think if you come with us on this journey, if you take the time to read our stuff, if you go to our website, I hope you'll say, this is not perfection, but this is pretty damn good. If we can get this, if we can win over the government to agree to let citizens into this process in an agreed, positive, constructive way, that will be real progress. And I think the reason to say that is what you can do in working with us, not standing back and wait until something goes wrong, but actually be on the field with us, is actually you'll be a part of the next great democratic evolution rather than the demise of democracy. Now, we all spent over 100 years fighting for the franchise. Sometimes I think we're still fighting that battle, when in a way that battle has all but been completely won. What's the next great battle? The next great battle is to give our democracy back to our citizens, to actually make sure, perhaps in the long run, that every parliamentary bill goes to citizens first before it goes to members of parliament, to make sure that every issue is part of a national conversation in which all of our efforts should be seated. Of course, you need 100 people in a room or there, something like that, to come up with the end product, but that should arise from an open conversation. I hope that Kerry maybe later will say a few things about how we can realise our ambition of 10 million founding mothers and fathers. That with the new technology that we've got, we can actually do that and engage people. If we can reach out to people, if we can make those connections, build those bridges, then we'll actually have a democracy we can be proud of, rather than one that we reminisce about before the bad guys took over. Thanks, Rod.
Thanks very much, Graham. Before we move on, just a couple of things. First of all, we've had an absolutely fantastic suggestion in the questions, which is to democratize the asking of questions in our discussion. And I absolutely love this. So if you go to the live event Q&A, you should see that it's possible to like or give a thumbs up to a question that you think is particularly worth asking. So what I'm going to do is, when we come to our general discussion, I am going to prioritize those questions with the most likes. Now, I understand that this is voting and involves very little in the way of deliberation, but I think we should run with it just in the spirit of the talk. So that's the first thing. The second thing, we do have a question just specifically for Graham, and apologies, I'm going to paraphrase a little bit just to make it bite size. So do follow up in general discussion at the end. But this is, Graham, this is from Paul Vissels, who agrees with you about not undermining elected politicians. And again, forgive me for paraphrasing, just says that, asks whether or not you support the movement advocating for sortition assemblies to replace elections and elected parliaments and councils.
I've got a lot of opinions about a lot of stuff. I'm very focused and I concentrate on the job in hand that needs my attention. So Paul, you're the grit in the oyster and you always come up with difficult questions like that. And I'm a former politician, so I'm going to dodge it because seriously, I think I need, and everybody else needs to focus on objective number 1, the first step. Your question, Paul, is about number 10, and I'm not going to speculate on where we are, but you will never get there unless you get the first steps in place. That means getting a system that citizens think has got value, just like people cherish the jury system now. It's probably one you wouldn't invent, but hopefully people will say that's the sort of thing we should consider. Now, if it should be considered, it should not be anyone on the screen today who decides that, certainly not Graham Allen. It should be a question, Paul, that we would put perhaps when we've established citizens' conventions as part of our culture, when we've established a What Works Centre for citizens' conventions and deliberative democracy, that should be something maybe that's on next year's agenda or the year after, and it needs proper, serious discussion. I'll be part of that discussion, so come along to that, Paul, and you'll actually find out what I really think.
Okay, thanks very much. So I think we should move on to Kerry Davis. Kerry, over to you.
Thank you, and hello all. So similarly to Graham, I don't have slides to share. There's a few kind of points and reflections that I wanted to cover, and I do have like a very short video to show you as well, so it won't all just be me talking at you for the entire time. But just picking up on some of the kind of ground, if you like, that Graham has laid out and the proposal lays out. I thought a useful contribution to the discussion would be to try to identify three areas that I think something like a citizens' convention might address in terms of the challenges we currently face in democratic and constitutional reform and renewal, with respect to how, if we're actually implementing something like the citizens' convention, how might it move against some of those challenges. And I also want to offer sort of one reflection on how we might get there. And so I hope to be able to pick up Graham's request of trying to sort of also imagine what it might mean to operate a process like this at scale, or for that to be part of an otherwise sort of overall plan. So obviously there are a range of different aspects around deliberative principles and deliberative processes which are contained in the plan around the Citizens' Convention, but I just want to focus on 3. And they are where something like a Citizens' Convention can address some of the current context that we see in terms of social attitudes, in terms of polarisation of views and or on polarising topics. I want to talk a little bit about where one of the challenges that sometimes we face in and around this space is an over-reliance on opinion polling and consultation. And obviously I'm a qualitative researcher, so I have bias, but nonetheless go with me. And the third is the role that deliberative processes can play, but also a framework like the Citizens' Convention in terms of just accessing everyday lives. So obviously Andrew mentioned in his introduction this idea that we sometimes might potentially pejoratively talk about ordinary people as opposed to like what other types of people there are, but also what it means in terms of where deliberation sits in terms of accessing everyday lives, in terms of going beyond kind of more elite discourses, more political discourses, and in doing so engaging in the politics of knowledge, which I think are highly relevant and end up being quite salient in deliberative processes, depending on how you move between theory and practice. So they're the things I just want to talk a little bit about in the time I've got available. So around the sort of first challenge around polarisation of views, we hear a lot about that kind of currently, and King's have done some interesting work on that recently. A report published last year around Divided Britain, obviously pushed forward intensely by debates around Brexit and other topics in the public imagination that people sit on various sides of. And obviously normatively, deliberative approaches are designed to try to achieve consensus in terms of decisions or recommendations. So they sit really counter to this idea that where there might be kind of deep division on particular topics, that somehow or other this process can knit people back together. And this is, of course, by design. So with a mixture of access to trying to provide impartial information or access to experts, however defined, as well as through the use of small group facilitated discussions of the type that is all contained within the proposals which we've shared with you in advance. You know, these two things are intended to create environments around mutual respect that prioritise the civil exchange of views. And in fact, you know, much deliberative work in general is predicated on the fact of bringing different people together, as opposed to other forms of research where, and qualitative research, where you might actually seek to bring people together who share something in common. The diversity, the inherent diversity in the public, and therefore in the ways in which these conversations need to happen, is a sort of underlying idea behind deliberation. And it's often the case, certainly theoretically, that access to sometimes new information prompts thoughtfulness for people, and you give people space for active reflection. So it's these kind of characteristics which actually help move people towards consensus on things that they otherwise might feel quite far apart on. So I think the other thing that's important around the whole idea that deliberative democracy, and certainly forms of deliberative process of the sort that Citizens' Convention can be, also contain within them dynamics that help address common challenges that can reinforce polarisation as opposed to aspects of consensus. So for example, where not everyone always gets their say, or if, like me, you come from a community development background, that the usual suspects is not just a film. They are the same people in a certain area who always turn up to available consultations or turn up to the village hall, or, so how do you get beyond that? And actually, I think there's lots in terms of the design of deliberation, and again, what would be interwoven and is interwoven in terms of the principles of the convention around moving beyond that and making room for more people, more voices, and setting up processes which help to incorporate them. So so I sort of wanted to make that point in terms of moving towards consensus. And of course, I think it's also important to recognise that in terms of the prospects around addressing polarisation of views, that not all deliberative processes need people to come to consensus. So it's not the case, within this kind of grand pantheon of different ways you can cut this cake. I think it's also important to acknowledge that sometimes that's important and necessary, but there are other times in which these types of fora can be useful and necessary and important in their own right in order to explore views, look for shifts in attitudes, and enable people to learn from each other without necessarily then also having to come to conclusions at the end. So there's a bit of a mixture in there, which I think it's worth keeping an eye on in terms of process and what one is really trying to achieve. So that's something, a set of thoughts around how it might act in that way. The second thing I wanted to touch on is how deliberative processes sort of help access plural views in the general public and offer access to everyday lives in a way that some often forms of policy making do to varying degrees. And one of the things I wanted to bring in with this is this idea of the politics of knowledge, which I think are really contained and held, and from my money anyway, certainly, although it is a slight soapbox of mine, are sort of an integral underpinning aspect of the philosophy of deliberation, in terms of inviting others to engage in a conversation that might otherwise be only being held in certain places and spaces. And various authors have argued around the value, if you like, of experiential or lay or local knowledges, whatever you want to call them, enabling perspectives on policy making that policymakers can't, by definition, by design, by who you talk to and what you see and what the norms are in your place and space. And so the sort of essential work of bringing different people together and providing a platform for discussion in that way is clearly, for me anyway, one of the major advantages of something like a Citizens' Convention in this space, because as Graham was outlining, one of the issues that we've got is a democratic deficit, and we've got division and disagreement on the way forward, but we've also got the opportunity to try to sort of move towards the transformation of some systems. So that somewhat suggests that you need to use non-traditional routes to get there. So not that I would argue that deliberation is non-traditional, it rather depends on how you see the thing. But nonetheless, I think that this combination of being open to more plural views in the general public and finding ways to connect them through in these types of processes is an essential opportunity, and one that I feel very strong about. I think it's also worth saying that I was listening to a talk recently that the RSA were doing, and an activist and organizer in the States called Panthea Lee was talking about, how it's difficult to solve lots of social, issues that end up being manifested in social spaces that just through elite discourses, because often they're the reasons that the issue is there in the first place. So again, this kind of push towards sort of transformation, looking at different routes to policy making, thinking about the other voices and people and perspectives that they contain as an essential part of transforming some of the opportunities that we have now for doing things. So yeah, so that's the sort of second point I wanted to just offer something about. And then the third thing, which is very closely related to that, is that obviously deliberation can otherwise be described, or has been described certainly by James Fishkin in the States, as democracy when the people are thinking. But two things flow from that in terms of the practicalities and the implementation, is both why would they want to come and think in these ways, and how might they take up, and why might they take up the opportunity to engage, so we can set up processes and say that we've got, you know, so much thought has gone into something like the convention, but you need people to come and participate. But also, how are we hearing them speak? So there's, again, a sort of large literature, if you're interested, in terms of how people communicate and what the sort of communicative ideals are, if you like, in deliberative spaces. And what's considered an ideal form of communication is contested. So some people think that what should happen in deliberative work is that everybody is very rational, and you end up having this reasoned debate among equals, which again is certainly a really sound principle. And often those types of dimensions also govern dominant forms of policy making. We think that these things are sort of necessary in order to come up with good policy. But there are plenty of people who also think that reason is usually seen as neutral and often dispassionate, and therefore it can exclude lots of people from the way they make sense of the world, but also how they might want to tell you about that. So if we, as we do in the Citizens' Convention, you know, kind of conceive of the opportunity of deliberation as being inclusive, and being able to be open to and listening to a whole range of different voices and perspectives, it somewhat suggests that you have to contend with the parallelations that are inherent in knowledge and knowledge forms. And so how you listen to people, how they can be invited to share what they know or what they think, thinking very much around the kind of participation in deliberative spaces as inclusion, giving weight to different voices, I think are all things which become really critical and important to keep an eye on, rather than assume that creating the space enables everybody to come. And certainly in terms of implementation, these are just some points I wanted to make around not just inviting people to think, but also how we can hear what it is that they're thinking. And that what a difference it can make when people think that what they are saying has value and is being heard in terms of the quality, legitimacy, depth, and potential outcomes of a process. So there are a few points in terms of areas that I certainly am thinking about, and in terms of the convention, some of the dimensions and parameters which are more to do with implementation, but you know, I am a doer person, so these are the things that I go to. But just by way of illustration, I thought it might be useful to just put you in the picture. I'm going to stop talking for a minute. About some work that James Fishkin and some of our colleagues have done in the States. You may have heard of something called America in One Room, and this was a large-scale deliberative poll which happened last year with over 500 Americans. And this is just a really short clip, but I think it somewhat illustrates some of the points, or I hope it does anyway, some of the different dimensions of the things that I was just putting up there, and it does it relatively neatly. So I'm just going to put that on the screen. And make sure I click all the right buttons. Okay.
You take the triggers for partisan tribalism out of the conversation and just talk about the issues, it removes a lot of the poison.
We don't have to settle for the half-dead democracy that we have.
Does anybody in this room make $7.25 an hour? Okay, because I do.
They were wary when they came. Talking about politics?
We brought them from all over the country.
Over 500 registered voters to Dallas.
You are surrendering 4 days of your life to what we think is going to be an extremely important exercise in American democracy.
What's missing in our public life is alternatives. Everything is yes, no. You're for me, you're against me. Life isn't like that.
America in One Room brings a scientific sample of the nation to a single place where they can talk to each other in a civil manner.
We've got enough people.
People were lynched here.
It's organized as what I call a deliberative poll. It gives you a picture of what public opinion would be if the people thought their voice mattered and really grappled with the issues.
My name's Jacqueline Trerr. I'm from Houston, Texas. I graduated high school, but immediately became pregnant. so I did not go off to college. So that I was a teen mother. I am now a single mother of 2 boys. Does anybody in this room make $7.25 an hour? Okay, because I do. And I make roughly $1,800 a month. My rent is $1,130. That leaves me less than $600 for electricity. I have to have the internet or my kids can't do their homework.
I never thought about trying to live on minimum wage. I realize that sounds just terrible, but I never thought about the reality of that.
We do nothing. I don't do frivolous things like Starbucks. When I ask for help, I'm told to get another job. When I am trying to figure out how my kids are going to get their lunch the next day, that's what I'm met with. And somehow it's my fault. I'm a CNA, certified nurse's aide, so I help take care of the elderly. I do actually have a really nice job right now where I take care of a man who's in his late 60s and he's a paraplegic. Well, yeah, because if it wasn't for my SNAP benefits, I wouldn't have the money to feed my kid. And the worst part is the shame you can receive from it. You're judged. Is my purse too nice? Are people going to think I'm living off of the government? Well, you're lazy. You obviously don't work hard enough. Get a better paying job. Duh. You know, or get a second job. Why don't you have a second job? I get that a lot. I do have a few little side hustles. Uber, doing favors for friends, selling stuff on eBay. My oldest is 17. His top college is Harvard, and right beneath that, MIT. My youngest son has a few special needs. Finding a job at which I can be home with him in the evening and not leaving it up to his older brother to have to take care of him in the evenings is something that's extremely important to me.
And Jackie, I do, like, just listening to you and what you were saying about how someone told you just get another job. You actually have 3 jobs. You're a mom, you have your regular job, and then you're not just any mom. You have a child with disabilities. That is a job on its own right there. I commend you, like, deeply. So
I don't know many people that are at federal minimum wage. Meeting them has been enlightening and eye-opening.
Some of my social science colleagues have wrongly concluded from ordinary polls that the public in aggregate is incompetent. But what we have found is that under conditions where people think their voice matters, the public is actually very smart.
We have a single mom with 2 children who's working for minimum wage, and she's been very open around the struggles that she has.
I've changed my entire mind about millennials because I've got some in there that are just wonderful. They're smart, thoughtful, hardworking.
A couple of the people in the group went beyond where they thought they would ever go in sharing their experience and their lives.
It was really nice that everybody here would say, I'm glad that you came, you know, because I didn't know, or I didn't understand how hard certain things are because, you know, your lives are different. It's hard some mornings to get up and go to work and go, why am I doing this? What is the purpose? It's not going to get any better. So the fact that no one judged me and told me to get another job, or you need to work harder, or you need to go back to school, it was really nice. It was a really nice judge-free weekend, and it felt really good. So thank you. Thank you so much.
This shouldn't be seen as jury duty. This shouldn't be seen as an obligation that Americans have. I think it should be cool and exciting and coveted to engage in a civic manner.
So I just wanted to show you that to sort of put you in the picture a little bit about some of those points and some of the what realising something like this convention might contain, and also just to kind of illustrate there some of the ways in which people were hearing, learning and responding to people from very different points of view. So I'm definitely over my time. There's a few points and comments and ideas that I've got about what it means to take advantage of new technologies, because obviously what you saw there was face-to-face, and what we'll most likely end up doing with the convention, certainly in the next 6 months or so, would be all based online, but I suspect people also have ideas about that, and I think it will come up in the discussion. So I'm going to pause there, and I can follow up. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kerry. So I think we'd probably better move straight on to Marta. I can see lots of questions that are going to be really good for discussion, and I can also see the order in which they're being democratically decided as well. So keep doing that. Keep publishing your questions. Marta, we'll go straight on to you, and then we'll have discussion in just a minute.
Great, thank you, Rod. Let's see. Great. Hopefully you can see it. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about why actually, taking slightly bit more general point of view than both Kerry and Graham, I'm going to talk why actually I think deliberative democracy has certain future in UK. And here, when both Kerry and Graham were coming from a bit more policy, a bit more practitioners perspective, my perspective is going to be a bit more academic. So during my talk, I'm going to talk about, first of all, why even change? Why change democratic system? What's potentially is wrong and what could go better? Finally, further, I'm going to draw on deliberative ideals. And here are the ideas coming from philosophy, democratic studies, democratic theory, thinking about how the world should be or how potentially the democratic system could work within the UK. Finally, despite the ideals being ideals, so thinking about how the world should be organized, I'm going to show or argue how it could be potentially institutionalized. And here the Citizens Convention for UK definitely is one idea of institutionalizing this sort of democratic ideals. My final argument will be that there is definitely a way forward to democratic future in the UK. So first of all, why even change? UK democratic system has unwritten constitution, and at least as opposed to systems within the Europe, there is some strong resistance, at least in my opinion, within the UK to introduce deep democratic changes. In Europe, there's almost one revolution after another. It used to be historically, there is a lot of changes in terms of constitution, written law. Within the UK, the current system we are having is something what was built up layer after layer from generations and generations. And there is some resistance for maybe introducing new constitution or written constitution overall, of making some random changes. So why do I think that actually right now we are in this moment within the UK, why the change could be needed? I think we are standing, or the UK society is standing in the front of quite specific democratic or overall challenges. First, we are standing in the front of challenge connected to post-COVID and post-COVID recovery. Who is going to lose? Who's going to win? Maybe how should we manage social and economic recovery in a way that all the parts of the UK will be equally benefiting out of that? Or how we can make it to prioritize both social and economic recovery? Other really important question which UK society is currently facing is connected to devolution. Scottish or Welsh independence movements show that there are a lot of tensions between more centralized government and more devoluted one. I think there's also problems about what's the future for the UK. It's also very nicely illustrated by current tensions and certain resistance from the mayors of cities like Manchester or even London in terms of following or accommodating or simply responding to centralized policies introduced by the UK government in terms of COVID. Connected to that is also a question of Brexit. Currently, we are standing 2 months in the front of Brexit. We still don't really know what's the future, how the future will look like. So there are questions how we are going as a society to shape the future of Europe, how we are going to shape the future of other nations and moving each other as well. Finally, there is persistent inequality within the UK, and I'm talking about poverty, so socioeconomic inequality, but also about racial inequality and racial tensions, which are deeply embedded and which are asking for some significant changes. So you can notice, or one can notice, that all those problems are a bit different, or they do concern slightly different problems. And I can tell you that coming from academic field, actually all the social problems are somehow connected. And indeed, in this case, it's the same. So I wanted to argue that all those problems have something in common. First of all, they concern many many people or many aspects of society. I think actually I could say they are concern all of the members of the society. And furthermore, they put different interests or interests of different groups or they could put interests of different groups in tension. So for example, in terms of Brexit, those tensions could be connected to thinking about the union or thinking about independence and nationalistic values versus cosmopolitan values. In terms of COVID, it could be different groups connected to, I know, northern of Scotland, northern of UK versus southeastern of England. As a result, all those problems also are embedded in terms of conflicting values. For example, what's really important for the society, nationalism and pride, or maybe cosmopolitan values and openness. Consequently, there are no obvious solutions to that, and the results or the answers to them would be highly controversial. All those problems are also highly complex. They concern values, judgments, facts, assessment, emotions, beliefs, and a lot of groups of societies. And it's very, very difficult to predict how one solution would trickle down and lead to another sort of results. As a result, I would like to propose this is the time to introduce a bit more democratic ideals and to refer to all this work within democratic theory and democratic philosophy to think about how potentially we could shape society. And I'm going to come back to those problems. I'm going to argue how democratic ideals and its implementation can actually directly respond to those problems and their characteristics. So when I'm talking about deliberative ideas or democratic ideas, I'm thinking about deliberative democracy. This topic was already, or this idea was already mentioned both by previous speakers, and I'm sure the audience is very well known, but just in case I'm going to introduce it, so please, if you know very well what deliberative democracy, please ignore this part. Deliberative democracy is this sort of ideals, how we should organize the society, and kind of assumes that instead of only voting and professional politicians, we should engage everyone in the society in the decision-making process. But this decision-making process shouldn't be, I don't know, random choosing of a certain option or voting on the decision-making or even bargaining and arguing. It should be embedded in very, very specific way of making decision-making. In this decision-making, which is called deliberation, it's based on ability of all the participants to gain some information about what's happening in the policy and to introduce, to learn, to be able to reflect on what they just learned and to be able to communicate with other members and to provide some reasons which other members would be able to understand. I'm going to come back to this process a little bit later because right now it could look a bit theoretical or maybe not very easy to follow or to grasp. But this process of deliberative democracy argues that this very specific process, thanks to inclusion of deliberation and also thanks to inclusion of all the affected in a process which treats everyone equally, which is based on mutual respect and based on this reason but of reflective debate, we are able as a society during this decision-making process, we are able to move from narrowly defined self-interest to something like common interest, something like what would be the best for us as a society, what would be the best for a lot of us, not only what would be the best for me. And finally, for deliberative democracy, it's not only process, which is important, but also there is a lot of evidence and there are a lot of arguments that the outcome is much more legitimate, that the outcome is simply better because it can include a lot of people, include a lot of variety of different points of view and lead to this better way of decision making. Consequently, it also deliberative democracy offers sort of alternative to existing currently in the UK system that basically the winner takes it all, whether it's a parliament or winner in the debate. Okay, so when I'm thinking about deliberative democracy, I think it's quite helpful to think about three sort of pillars for deliberative democracy. So first of the pillar, you can see arches, actually, they are not pillars, but that's what I found. So first kind of pillar or arch would be existing institution. And indeed, in the UK, a lot of them are actually already deliberative. So there's a parliament, there's judiciary, there should be media. Media should deliver reliable information to all the members of the society. But existing institutions not enough for deliberative democracy to happen. What's really important is that the society has deliberative culture, deliberative society in which the deliberative norms are really deeply embedded, in which all of us are eager to learn some new information, reflect on the common good of the wider implication of given decisions in the society, or how we want to organize the society. And we are open, or each of us are open to certain debate and argumentation about how we are going to proceed. But finally, something what's recently, or actually last 30 years, and recently in the UK, not last 30 years, last few years, something what became really, really important, kind of really widely implemented, would be democratic and deliberative innovations. So those innovations would be one-off events, some institutional complementation, or some sort of institution, short-term or longer-term processes, which complement to other pillars when these are crumbling a little bit. So, for example, if the existing institutions are not exactly deliberative, if society and culture is not precisely performing as we should, as we wanted it to be, that's precisely the moment to introduce those democratic innovations. So, how those deliberative innovations could look like, and why do I think it is actually a way forward in a way, or in a moment we are currently experiencing within the UK? So, as I already explained, those will be sort of one-off events, very rarely currently institutionalized. So basically they just happen once in a lifetime, and then will be, new iteration of something, but as opposed to institutionalized forms which happen every year. So they could happen over a weekend, over months, could be like some new interesting processes. And the idea of democratic innovations is to create some specific forum which would invite or reach or welcome ordinary citizens and provide them circumstances and create conditions for them to re-engage in really good, deliberate and balanced decision making. So there are a lot of examples of those events, and potentially members of the audience already know some of them. One of them, very, very famous one, will be participatory budgeting, originated in Porto Alegre in Brazil. Right now, I know it's in many, many places locally in the UK. The idea of participatory budgeting is to invite inhabitants of certain area to decide and make decisions about priorities in local budget. For example, to fund a school, or for example, to fund a new kindergarten in the borough. The other idea, kind of other democratic innovation, will be deliberative polling. So that was actually the clip you've just seen from Kerry with James Fishkin. The idea here is to use selected random selection to create informed public opinion on selected issues. Finally, something what's I think convention proposed by Graham is very much a good example of would be citizens' assembly. Citizens' assembly is a larger form of deliberative innovation, which accumulates a larger amount of people as citizens, invites them and creates special conditions for them to create some sort of recommendation for governing body. And there is a lot of variety in which, in a way, how citizens' assembly can work, but I just want to guide you a little bit step by step by the common characteristics of this form of democratic innovation. So first, there is selection, and the organizers of citizens' assembly use randomized selection in order to reach literally representative sample, almost representative sample of the wider population. However, I wanted to say it's randomized, so it's not fully random, just because organizers very often would go and complement the random selection with targeted selection of those groups who are usually marginalized. So those groups which are very difficult to reach, and those who are not usually included in other forms of institutions, those whose voices are particularly important on the issue analyzed by the assembly. After that, there are three different phrases, and as I already mentioned, different institutional design would deliver those different, or kind of schedule those different phrases differently, but they are always somehow placed within the citizens' assembly. So first, there is a phase of learning, during which participants are provided with expert knowledge and expert information on the issue at hand. This information is not unbiased. It could be leading towards different solutions, but the essence of the learning phase, it will be that the information is really trustworthy, relies on facts and information. As opposed to that, there is a listening phase in which during citizens participating in citizens' assembly are opening themselves to listening to different voices out there in the community via public hearings, via people who are coming just to testify, very often much more partisan, much more engaged, much more emotional sort of testimonies going on. Finally, there are rounds of deliberations, which could also happen after learning or listening phases. And deliberations are basically group discussions, either in small groups or plenary groups, which are usually based on analyzing what had happened, what the participants just learned, trying to move forward, and finally reaching recommendation. What's really important in citizen assembly work is that the deliberation are actually facilitated. There is a trained facilitator of moderator who ensures that members do not go in circle with their decision or get distracted. So continue and move towards the final recommendation. But furthermore, moderation is also really important because it enables really those marginalized members and those who usually do not have, for example, confidence to speak, to really make their voice heard and to really truly participate in the process. Finally, the Citizens Assembly arrive at some sort of recommendation, and there is, as Kerry just mentioned, it doesn't have to be, some of them don't even arrive at recommendation. The recommendation can be one, could be a variety of scenarios. There is a lot of institutional differences in them. So why I think it's actually kind of important, especially right now. So this will be coming back a little bit to those different problems which UK is currently facing. So Citizens Assembly tend to, or they do produce, as the literature would argue, and probably I would argue as well, better results. Better results just because the members who participate in Citizens Assembly are definitely better informed than average public would be. They are better informed decisions than simple voting or even referendum. Furthermore, those institutions can produce better results just because they engage so much more diversity than professional politicians would do. Finally, or furthermore, there will be also much more legitimate in terms of thanks to precisely the inclusion of all the members of the public and also embedding these deliberative processes based on reflective decision-making instead of impulsive one. Furthermore, finally, the results or kind of advantage of Citizens Assembly is that they do not polarize. For academics, that would be actually one of the criticisms of Citizens Assembly, that maybe they're too consensual or they tend to be too consensual. But I think in current situation of the UK, when the UK is so extremely polarized, when a lot of members of the public consider people with very different opinions almost as evil and kind of not as members of the public anymore, I think we do need some sort of way of embed some sort of healing and finding way forward, even if that will be temporary. So I'm arriving to the conclusion, and surprisingly or not, I'm going to argue that yes, we should go for much more innovations, and Citizens Convention would be way forward to do that. But of course, I have some comments or kind of way to think about before organizing or during organizing. I want to emphasize that democratic innovations and a convention is not on its own a solution to all the problems. It's just one of the very, very many. And if there is no connection with other pillars, so existing institution and the wider society, it's basically we are innovating in vacuum. It won't really have any impact. Finally, my other point is that the organization of those innovations and attention to detail is really, really important. I would really emphasize how important and essential is the inclusion of marginalized groups, and also how important is to emphasize and provide the scope for exercising real agency of those involved, maybe potentially also in the design of the process. But yeah, that's all. Thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to the question.
Okay, thanks very much, Marta, and in fact to all of the speakers and to Andrew as well. This is the point where we make our talk a lot more deliberative insofar as we can. I'm going to go through some of the questions that we've been asked based on their popularity amongst everybody here and kind of work our way down through there. Hopefully, we'll be able to get through a good chunk of them at the very least. So without further ado, I'm just going to start. There's a question from Nathan Young, which I think is directed to all of the panel, really, which asks, is there evidence that citizens' assemblies change the minds of the whole population? So I think I can see lots of thoughtful faces on my screen. I know you can't yet. I'm going to ask Kerry this first of all, just from a kind of evidence point of view.
Yeah, so do they change the mind of the whole population? Well, I don't think there is any evidence that I'm aware of that would give you a definitive yes or a definitive no. I think that what I would say in terms of evidence is that citizens' assemblies or other forms of deliberative process are often, as Marta was indicating in terms of those other pillars and arches, interrelated to a series of other forms of or formats, if you like, or ways in which people can kind of have their say, learn, kind of engage with or pick up on some of the debates, some of the decisions and some of the deliberations that happen in those spaces. So I think in that sense, I think there's probably more evidence, or it's probably in terms of how I tend to think about it is what the platform, if you like, or what the opportunity of the investment in that specific deliberative space means for the kind of ripples and the relationships to wider parts of society. So, for example, one of the kind of core tenets around deliberative work in general is that it's transparent and accessible. So even if you're not the person in the room, if you haven't been randomly selected, you should be able to kind of view and have access to the evidence which participants are receiving. You should be able to have some summary of the discussions that are going on. And I think it's in those ways that those kind of flows of information out can also have the opportunity to influence and encourage reflection with others. I think also what I'd add to that in terms of some of the design plans for the Citizens' Convention, and again, Graham, you may want to pick up on this, is this idea of how the deliberative opportunity something like the convention offers is interrelated to, so I think you mentioned it before, didn't you, Graham, about a kind of 10 million founding fathers, mothers, people, you know, so how is it that if you're not sat in the room, that this is also something that's both for you, but that you can also pick up on, learn from, engage with, influence, again, along deliberative lines, so not just simply answering, you know, binary propositions or opinions. So setting in place a range of other opportunities, certainly in our plans, to try to do that. And the role of technology, I think increasingly, if you ask me the same question in 5 or 10 years' time, I might answer you differently. So I think that increasing access to new technologies and the role of the internet is becoming a real kind of edge of innovation in deliberative work, simply because it offers you the opportunity to scale. And lots of scholars in this space will talk about the public sphere. So, and these are some of the points, Marta, you were making around, you know, a kind of infrastructure, a network, a kind of process by which everybody can be regularly involved in sort of everyday shaping and reflecting on political and other issues. So I think that those types of the technologies coming through are one of the ways in which that might change the answer to that question. So I know that's a, you know, that's a classic kind of like roundabout non-answer, but I think only in relation to the fact that I don't think the evidence is clear at this point, but I think those other phenomena are in play, which is one of the ways in which those things happen or can happen.
Thanks. So Marta had a point to raise, and Graham as well. Guys on the panel, if you want to chip on the questions, just raise your hands and wave at me, and I'll make sure you get a turn.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Rod. So indeed, I just want to second what Kerry just said. There is actually some experimental publications right now by Jane Sutton and Lalan Radova and others, which was just published, showing that based on the experimental research design in Ireland, that actually if wider public is faced with the information or similar information with which Citizens' Assembly or members of democratic innovations were faced, they also tend to change their mind and change opinions. One of the ideas on why the spreading of the information presented to participants during the democratic innovations events was one of those key aspects of James Fishkin's idea that indeed we cannot have really isolated democratic innovations, but we really have to enhance the information coming out and producing why they produce different aspects, what's happening on there. But I think precisely the sort of events we are having right now, the internet sphere can also very much benefit with that. So I definitely think there will be just much more research on that showing the impact, but the short answer will be yes.
Graham, you're up.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I think the question assumes that there's an agenda here to change opinions of the people from A to B. The whole basis of deliberation is actually to enable people to explore and come to conclusions of their own. It is not to push people into a particular agenda for or against a particular thing. And sometimes, as I mentioned earlier, they may come up with things that people like us and people not like us may object to in some shape or form. The answer to that is to have, as I mentioned earlier, the actual decision-making, recommendation-creating process to be seated in a much wider national conversation, as we've just outlined graphically in the document, where the fried egg there, right at the middle, is the national summit where it all gets pulled together, which itself is surrounded by the conventions that discuss particular issues, which is even a bigger the white of the egg, if you like, of a national conversation that Kerry mentioned. And that has much more ability to reach out to greater numbers of people, and Kerry's far more expert in this than me, but on things like the use of deliberative mediation and facilitation. Some of the work they're doing in the States now and in Taiwan is ranking up the numbers to, you know, hundreds of thousands of people participating, not in a yes, no, black, white sort of thing, but a nuanced debate where opinions can be aggregated, questions can be reformed. And so that's just one part of it. If we've got literally 10 million founding mothers and fathers, as opposed to 40 white guys in Philadelphia is the other side to that, then much more people can influence the debate, and they in turn change their own minds and self-educate, rather than that there's some sort of, well, we're only really doing this because we want to abolish the second chamber. I wonder if we can come up with some nifty device to get the public to buy into that. It's not like that at all. It is process. And that's really difficult for people, particularly like me, to let go of the idea that, you know, the outcome of this isn't going to be the version that I want to see of devolution and a federal United Kingdom or whatever it may be. Or in another case, of course, people who want to have a particular view on environmental issues or transport issues or social care. No, you're in the wrong business. This business of deliberation is not about having having something in mind that you want to try and work people over to. That actually undermines deliberation. And a good example was when some people got very excited that we could use deliberation to get the answer we wanted on Brexit. You know, that would have killed deliberation stone dead. We wouldn't even be having this conversation right now, Rod, because that is not the use to which a democratic instrument should be put. The democratic instrument's job is to actually find out, to measure, or to engage, or to explore. And so I think we should be a little bit careful about running towards agenda-driven techniques.
Thanks, everyone. And I hope that goes some way towards answering the question. Feel free to follow up if not, and hopefully we'll be able to get to you. So next up, we have a question with which I have a great degree of sympathy by Ellie Radcliffe, who asks, why deliberation rather than more participatory methods of democracy? Which I think is an excellent question. Marta.
Well, that's a good question. I'm also going. Well, I do not consider those two aspects as different. Deliberative methods would be emphasizing reason giving, information as much, at least in my opinion, as participation. Participatory methods on its own can be very different. Maybe some of them would not necessarily provide so much more information, maybe not necessarily would emphasize the need for providing reasoned debate and communication, and for providing reasons which other members could potentially accept. So I would argue we need to introduce, or there is a value in introducing a variety of arrays, a wide selection of different sort of institutional design, also participatory one, but also deliberative ones. I wouldn't consider them either or. But the more the merrier. In my opinion, the good process would combine elements of both participatory and deliberative.
And yes, Graham.
Yeah, very briefly too, I think Marta nailed it, but there's not, like, what's the expression, one club golfers, you know, when you're meant to have 18 different clubs for different situations, and have, like, no, I can hit everything with a putter or whatever it is. Not my game, but horses for courses. And what you want is a really rich diversity of instruments. And don't forget, also at scale, you want a different thing for a global issue. If you want to get people together on environmental change, you've got to have something that works across every nation across the planet. If you want to do something on traffic management in Cambridge, you know, you'll need to refine it in a different way. But equally, participative democracy, local democracy, it's almost like saying parish councils, national government. There's a whole range of things. The problem we've had is stagnation, where we've had a sort of governing structure which was good, arguably, for Victorians, or maybe even older. We're still with it and stuck with it, as they are in the States. And I speak as someone who's, as you know, a great advocate of a written constitution, but you need to evolve. You need to actually let a bit of fresh air into this. And in an age when everyone is literate, or most people are literate, in an age where most people, apart from me, are literate on technology, then you are there's an enormous wealth of ideas and inspiration and understanding which we're not tapping into. We pretend, as I did for 30 years of my life, oh, I'm an MP, I know the answer to everything. And nonsense. I'm an MP, I've got the sense to figure out that there's lots of other ways to get answers to engage with the public. And if we do that, back to the old point, Rod, if we do that, then people will feel they own their democracy. Even on occasions where their opinion doesn't win out, they'll say, well, I had my chance, I moved a couple of people, but I didn't win the whole debate. And I respect the fact that most people have worked very, very hard to come up with a particular view. So lots and lots of instruments. Let there be a plurality of instruments rather than a typical British one size fits all. Everything's got to go to the imperial centre, and you know, somehow the old system that maybe did work 200 years ago is still good enough. It isn't good enough. It is on the verge of collapse if we're not careful, but we do have ways, lots of ways, to actually revive it, and we should choose all of them. A little bit like, I mean, Kerry's much better on this than me, but on things like deliberative polling, you talk to some colleagues and they'll say, oh no, it's got to be my methodology. Oh no, it's got to be deliberative assembly, it's got to be deliberative. This problem is enormous. We will need all the above plus a lot more engagement and techniques and methodologies. Let's not say I am the keeper of the truth and only the thing that I invented or that I wrote a paper about is the one that we can use. Let's get everybody involved, and then we might get 10 million people joining up to frame the next democracy in the UK.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you will find no argument from me around identifying plural ways to approach a problem. And I think that I also couldn't agree more, kind of with one foot in academia often and one foot in policy. I do sometimes find myself kind of trending towards, oh, well, it should be this way and it's got to look like this, when actually the reality is, from a kind of citizen perspective and from a kind of transformational point of view, what you're saying is put to work the things that are available to you in order to kind of get where you're going. And some of the cul-de-sacs of contestation can be interesting, but they're not necessarily in the service of achieving the goal. The point I wanted to make in relation to kind of participatory methods, other, and deliberation, which Marta has already addressed in terms of them being on a spectrum, is actually with a kind of more pragmatic lens. And going back to one of the things that Andrew raised at the start about like what's realistic in terms of government, I think one of the other reasons it's important to be pitching for deliberation at the moment is because it's more possible. it's more realistic in my mind. It may still feel a bit visionary and ambitious, which is also fine. But just thinking about those kind of other modes of governance that different types of methods lead you towards, I think what we're saying, what we're arguing for, the space we're trying to occupy is kind of deliberation alongside representations. You know, the overhaul of representative democracy is not necessarily the end goal. It may be for some, it's certainly not for others. And so thinking about pragmatic, achievable possibilities to sit systems alongside each other, for me, is a more enriching and worthwhile pursuit in this, you know, in our time scale than highly transformatory processes, although I also talk about those, where, you know, forms of participatory governance might be that, you know, they might be 2 steps on down the road. So I do think there's something tangible around deliberation, and certainly the wave that it's experiencing now in terms of adoption or well, no, I won't say co-option, that's another question I've seen on the on the list, so I'm sure we'll come to it, but how those things and how they might be able to be articulated and understood and used alongside representative forms in the UK, rather than things which feel a little too far away, potentially from the perspective of policymakers and others, where you may spend all of your time convincing rather than half of it convincing and half of it trying to get something done. So I would also kind of advocate for seeing deliberation in a way almost as a more pragmatic route into alternatives than other forms of highly, you know, kind of highly participative and highly granular approaches. Yeah.
Okay, so thanks. So our next question is from an anonymous participant who asks, how do we move beyond asking binary questions of citizens? So, for example, about Brexit or gay marriage or nuclear power, and begin to understand the nuance of differing views and responses. Who wants to jump in from the panel? Who should I direct it to? Marta, hand straight up, then Graham. Okay.
Okay, sorry, I promised with unmuting. It's a slow connection, unfortunately. I wanted to say, even if a lot of those questions like Brexit or gay marriage or anything what was just mentioned is framed as a binary choice, it very rarely is. As I mentioned, with those complex, interconnected social problems and challenges, they're very rarely either A or B. They can be framed as like by parties, they can be framed as binary by referenda, but de facto there isn't. They usually are connected in a variety of values, judgment, facts, connections, etc. So actually, citizens' assemblies or democratic innovations unentangle them and show them that they are not binary choice, how much they enable to pop out different values which are connected to making decision, showing how different groups will be affected by the results, show how different policy making and what sort of social circumstances can result by different results. So actually, I think even if something is framed as binary choice, when they are put into democratic innovations, it provides the space for showing that they are very far away from being binary.
Shall I go, Rod? Yeah, I don't like following Marta. She said everything that I wanted to say. But just to add one extra thing, which is you enable citizens, or should enable citizens, to come to their own conclusions. Now, sometimes you will ask a question in general, and for example, what we've done, having had 5 years of talking to leaders of parliamentary parties and other senior people in Parliament, we came up with a list of 6 questions that we will put to government as possible topics for debate. If they want to genuinely talk about democracy, this is what we came up with. But that is not the end story, because government need to want to do this. If they don't want to do it, they're not going to play ball at all. So, but I just look at these, and they're on page 18 of the thing that you can download from the website, our website, and you can look at them yourself. But on the first question, I won't go through what they are, but what I will say, they use the word number 1, reviewing, blah, de, blah, de, blah, the powers of the second chamber. 2, examining. 3, reviewing. for proposing. So we're actually asking them to propose, but in a general field about how politics should be funded in this case. Then another examining question. So if you're doing it like that, you're actually saying to people, well, this is a general area where we think we've got a problem. There seems to be out there, all parties somehow seem to be thinking we could do better than the second chamber at the moment. So we say, have a look at this for us, will you? If you can come up with some stuff, great. But if we were to say, can you decide between option A and option B? And arguably that was not the way, certainly if you'd have done that on Brexit, you'd have repeated the referendum, in my opinion. Whereas maybe 4 years before the referendum, you could even have had a citizens' convention that discussed our future with Europe without being told you've got to come up with something either in or out. But no, you come up with what you want to have a talk about. And again, I defer to Kerry because she's just been doing whatever 2 years worth of work on all things Brexit, engaging with thousands of people, and didn't say, is this, answer yes or no. Said, go away and we're going to give you, Kerry, what was it, 6 months? I don't know, per thing. But she's better at this than I am. But allowing the development of people. And you know what? It's not just citizens who benefit from that process. It is the elected representatives who then start doing the job in the way that they thought they got elected to do. And then government, who are pitted against the opposition and have to answer to the press the next morning, they can start doing the job in a different way. Because, oh look, these are the suggestions that came from outside of politics, from 100 people who represent the people in the UK. We've sent it to Parliament to have a look, and now that's the way to have slow-cooked, very nutritious politics, rather than the Mac politics that we have at the moment. So I think that's the way to do it. Keep the questions broad, but do say to people, at the end of this, we'd like some recommendations. If you can't come up with stuff, okay, that's fine. Why should you when other people haven't? But we'd like you to do that. And I don't know anywhere in the world, maybe you can tell me, Rod, but I don't know where this has fallen foul of people saying, no, we just haven't got a clue here. We've spent 6 months talking to the best people in this field, but we can't think of anything to say. No one to my knowledge has ever said that. They've all come up with sometimes interesting and ingenious ways to move it forward.
Okay, thanks very much, everybody. So next question is from John Nugent, who asks, oh, this is good. If the output of a widespread, legitimate deliberative process clearly disagrees with government policy, and Graham, I think this touches on some of the things that you mentioned in your talk, right? If it clearly disagrees with government policy, perhaps on a regular basis, how could this be constitutionally resolved? And Graham, no apologies, I'm going to go straight to you with this one. Everybody else, just wave your hand when you're ready.
I don't think that anyone who said, I am going to give 6 weekends of myself for something that I volunteered for and with them was lucky to be drawn out of the hat, but I've had to stay in a hotel, I've had to ask these people to pay for my childcare, which we will do, and I'm going to be as awkward as I can be and come up with something that I know is totally impractical from government's point of view. Everybody in the country should be given £1 million at the end of Christmas. I think anyone who wishes to engage seriously in this process will actually have in mind the broader context and the broader atmosphere. There's a problem here, for example, on environment and climate. How do we get government to move towards where they think the answer lies? And you don't say it's got to be that or nothing. You say, try this, and you might actually see that you get a lot of support, it starts to work, and you may want to crank it up and do better. And in a way, that's why the whole thing about trust, the whole thing about the integrity of the process is really, really important. So it shows that citizens, when left to their own devices, when allowed to do democracy in good conditions, which I never did in 30 years in the House of Commons, I was told what to do. I was often told to vote a particular way on a bill I'd never had the chance to read and never heard the debate on. That's democracy in bad conditions. So that produces really angry, frustrated people in the House of Commons, and that's why it's very difficult to move stuff forward. And it looks antagonistic because it is. If you say to people, there's a better way to do this, you, as a person participating in that, you start off with a position of respecting the process and wanting your outcomes to be respected. So, hey, look, yeah, we can all screw this up if we all work hard enough, but you know what? There's a better way to do it, and we can do it better than we are doing at the moment.
Thanks. And Kerry, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, just very briefly. I mean, I think the question as well sometimes speaks to, I've been interested recently in kind of collecting worries about doing deliberation. Like, what are the reasons not to do it? What are some of the myths around it? What are some of the potential contests or disagreements that it throws up? And then therefore, what do we do then? And I think some of the question, as I interpret it, speaks to a worry, a concern that two things. One is that people will spend their time in the ways that Graham has illustrated, and then nothing happens. And actually, one of the things that's at risk there is then all of that hard work and all of that careful thought is essentially dismissed in terms of a translation into some kind of action or some kind of change. And that would be the worst type of, it's a kind of common thing, isn't it, across the participatory literature. It's like it's better to do no process at all than a bad process. And so I think that is one of the things which, as some of the things that you put forward there, Graham, about why that might not be the case in this instance, in terms of the integrity of the process, the way it's set up, and your laser focus on political endgame and what value that adds to the convention's approach. But the second thing as well is it is quite possible, isn't it? You invite people in, you invite them to consider a certain set of topics, and even within that kind of mediation of sort of reason, discussion, consideration, you do end up with propositions which people feel very strongly about, which end up being quite challenging for the people for whom they are intended. And I think that one of the things which, and again, that's quite common, it's happened, I'm sure we could all name a process we've seen where that's the case, and it's like a great idea, but it's never going anywhere. And for me, it just reinforces the importance, the value, both theoretically with deliberative work, but also in practice, of those who've got a stake in the outcome of the process being involved in the process itself. So that's not to say that they then have, there's a balance there, obviously, in terms of them not taking over the process or leading the process of special interest. But there's a concept in the literature around authenticity. So deliberating with authenticity. And I think it comes from Cohen, and his point is you have to be free from other determining agendas. Once you come into the deliberation, if you're a stakeholder or if you're a participant, you commit, you agree to do so in the room, as opposed to being led by the interests of outside others in the way that Graham described some of his MP career, right? So I think that again, that for me, that just reminds me about needing to draw attention to that point. And again, theory to practice, discuss, but to both avoid some of the potential pitfalls, but also to ensure that even if you then do end up with an outcome, a decision, a recommendation, which seems to run counter to much of the current kind of power structure, that there might be some room for manoeuvre because you've involved the people who have to do something with it as a result, and that be one of the ways to break that particular deadlock. And I can't comment on constitutional resolution, if not.
Okay, so thanks very much, guys. The next question is from Mark Fox. Mark, apologies, I'm going to squeeze it just a little bit. And if I've paraphrased incorrectly, please follow up. But basically, Mark asks, about the appetite for deliberative democracy in the UK. So we've got a parliamentary system and a tribalist electoral system. Brexit has clearly demonstrated Parliament's resistance to referendum decisions. And given the fatigue that resulted from Brexit and now COVID-19, where's the appetite in the UK for deliberative democracy? So, Graham's waving. We'll go to you first.
Well, I'd just say that you've listed, Rod, or your questioner has, all the reasons there is an appetite for doing this in a better way and a more serious yet practical way, because people have seen what has happened, not just on Brexit, but in Parliament. There is masses of evidence, and we have it in a big bank from whoever it is, you know, Pew or worldwide foundations that say democracy is approaching the brink, and people are fed up with democracy. They don't believe it anymore. Somebody said to me the other day, they asked a question in a hall, who believes in democracy? Everyone put their hands up. And who believes in the democracy we got now? And all the hands went down. So conceptually, people want to be democratic, but they don't have the right instruments. They don't have the faith in the tools of democracy, because the tools were really relevant when there was no franchise. But now we've got the vote. There are other means by which we can realise democracy. This is about culture, ultimately. And people will have faith if they see the culture of a new democracy is respecting citizens, and citizens are a central part of this. And again, I've got to say, if Michael Gove is listening, he needs to hear this again and again, that what is good for citizens engaging in democracy is good for the elected representatives and the government, because there'll be a lot more talking, a lot more dialogue, a lot more understanding, rather than artillery exchanges, First World War style, over particular issues in the press and in the House of Commons. So this is a way forward for lots of people. And I think, again, I've got to say, it's a cultural thing. This isn't just a one-off. We happen to be wanting to do a convention on UK democracy. We could equally have been a bunch of people who thought it'd be good to have a convention on transport policy in the UK. It could, if you see that this is an instrument that can be applicable to help get sensible engagement and then discussion and then recommendations that our representatives can say, wow, that's really helpful, then I think you're developing something that starts to take its place alongside the vote, alongside Parliament and government, not instead of. And that's why I think this is so important, because if we can demonstrate on this most sensitive of issues how we govern ourselves, that we actually found good ways to do that by using these new techniques, I think we're close to getting to change our culture back towards, well, that's not a very good metaphor, but towards a more viable set of functions and instruments than we've had hitherto. They've had their day, thank you very much, but now they need to be supported by more modern things in a world where everyone's literate and computer literate, etc.
Marta, you wanted to jump in.
Thanks. Yes, so I'm not really sure whether it answers really the question, what's the appetite? Because that's actually ultimately an empirical question. I didn't go out and ask people, create a survey. I think it was more a question for other people, maybe Kerry potentially. But I think there should be actually an appetite for more deliberative and more participatory forms of democracy within the UK. So my feeling, and that's just a feeling, is that there are a lot of frustration and tensions within the UK. There's COVID, there's massive unemployment, there are a lot of anxieties connected to Brexit. And currently, I think the UK society stands in a kind of the crossroads. So either we'll channel those frustrations into this belief and wider crisis of democracy in thinking that it's only voting, it's only professional politicians who will be interested only in their own interests, and rational way to deal with this frustration and anxiety is just to withdraw from the political life entirely and just try to maintain own life. Or maybe on the other way, we can actually, as a society and as politicians, policymakers, channel it into something constructive. We can channel it into actual engagement and to channel it into a way of addressing those issues. The reason why I think there also should be an appetite, not only on a normative and ideological level, is that it's precisely connected to current unemployment. So if you scroll through I don't really know precise level, but if you scroll through the document of the Convention of the UK, there is a proposition of payment for the participants. And I think it's really, really important aspect if we are thinking about unemployment and mass inequality in the UK, that those people will be paid for the time. So those people who might be furloughed, those people whose job might be lost because of the COVID or current transformation, can actually find something what reattaches them to society, what gives them meaning. So I think there is a lot of hope for that, and really a big necessity for more democratic ways and widest range of innovations within the UK.
Thanks, Marta. And I have a hand up from Kerry.
Yeah, just empirically, I think that certainly over the last 12 months or so with the projects that I've been involved in running, there is real appetite for people to, we've now worked with over 400 people in a kind of deliberative polling type process, looking at policy making post Brexit. And if anybody who's listening also saw some of the BSA launch a couple of weeks ago, you'll have seen some of our findings from that in terms of public attitudes in that space, but also what deliberation brought. And I think that's an example of larger scale deliberation with people, but also a number of other projects that have been about different things and driven by different starting points have been that people are really keen to have their say. And I think people are really keen to have their say in a sort of meaningful, thoughtful, engaging, collaborative type way, as opposed to just opinion polling, which was also a point I made earlier. This isn't a rant against opinion polling, by the way. It's just that, going over and above that in terms of expressing what you think and the opportunities, both whether they're driven by kind of social moral imperative or general interest. I think that certainly it's our experience at NatCen that people are really keen for deliberative spaces where they can come and explore, understand, and think that their voice and the conversations that they're having can be connected to political systems and the potential for change, and that being an important part of what motivates people to engage. I think the only other thing I wanted to reflect on that empirically is stop. Is that telling me to stop? No. Sorry, people were making little signs at me and I'm very bad at it. So that's okay, just let it all out, Davis. Right. So the other thing was just the point I was going to make is that I think it's really important as well when thinking about whether people have got appetite for it, is actually really trusting the public to have their say. I think sometimes people think, and especially in the sphere around kind of constitutional reform, people assume that things are really technical or people will find it boring or somehow or other it's not for them. And this kind of, this dissociation from politics and the political system is felt, and I think that actually that's not true. People are really keen to listen, learn, think, and have the ability and capability to kind of take what they're learning and transform that into kind of interesting, insightful, and important contributions. So obviously I'm biased, but our experience has certainly been that there's high appetite and opportunity for getting involved in highly complex and really sensitive but salient issues.
Hi,
Kerry,
Rod. Sorry, Kerry.
I'm really sorry, Graham.
I didn't mean to put you off there. I was just signalling to Rod just a very small point, which is to back up what Kerry was saying in terms of there's some fantastic work from the OECD. Claudia Wolitz's and a friends at OECD have pulled together almost like a Bible of all the fantastic work that's going on throughout the planet. And it's a great work of reference that we should all have. And you can, if you can't get it, you can link through to it on our website and it gives you that stuff. There's also great work being pulled together in a slightly different way by Democracy R&D. So there's more and more of this stuff which is out there, and now it's meeting a demand. A lot of people are hearing about this and they're saying, why don't we use it to do this thing? sometimes quite local and small, the flat pack democracy and people like this, doing quite small stuff to start with. Then there's other people who are doing literally some of the global issues. So great demand, and that information is being pulled together by some serious people, and it's a reference there for everybody.
And I should apologise to Kerry, that was simply my inability to understand that everybody could see me when I signalled to Graham, just a little one. My apologies. And just to add to Graham's point as well, there's another resource if you're looking for evidence of the demand of the variety of deliberative innovations, which is Participedia. If you just Google for it, you'll find it. I find an excellent place for cases, particularly here. Right, next question, before we run out of time. Paul Vittles has a really good question, which I'm going to chop just a tiny bit off. Basically asking, so if Marta's definition of deliberative democracy is really a deliberate definition of deliberative and participatory democracy, how can it be right that the current trends in running these things towards limited groups, so 20 to 100 people or so typically, how can that not be anti-democratic? How can quasi-random selection really be a democratic means of deliberation?
I guess that's a question to me, so I will respond. Sorry, I didn't mention. Well, yes, of course, there could be criticism that any sort of tool and any sort of institutional design which chooses selection of people is not democratic because it's not egalitarian. But kind of an answer to those sort of criticism is that usually those sort of events are happening as one-off, and there are a lot of the more of them, the more people will be included. There's also a variety of institutional design. So indeed, deliberative polls would involve 8 to 10 people, maybe 16 maximum, or 20, I don't remember. But actually, as Graham emphasized, the convention would involve much more people. I think the proposition was about 10 million, which is very, very egalitarian way of decision making. The final response to that would be thinking about deliberative innovations on their own could portray them as undemocratic. But usually the way democratic scholars would argue was to embed them in the wider democratic systems. So deliberative innovations wouldn't be only many of them, but they also rely on, referenda, existing institutions in parliament, wider debates, very good media, etc. So as a result, those would be sort of implemented pins here and there to complement wider democratic and more egalitarian system. And that's why they are not exclusive, they are not anti-democratic, they are just injection of certain procedures and deliberation, and also sometimes there are injections of something from the public more than the public to the wider system. So there is a variety of use of democratic innovations as well. But sorry, in that sense, they wouldn't be anti-democratic, they would be just complementing wider democratic system. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. From Mark Duke, a very direct question. Has anybody run multiple assemblies on the same topic to see how outcomes may vary? Kerry?
Yes, is the short answer. So the project I was referencing just a minute ago, where now over 400 people have been through deliberative polling on process around post-EU policy, that is essentially the same poll run twice. So we ran the first poll last year in June, and we run the second poll in October this year. The original intention behind that design actually was both to compare outcomes, but also to compare mode. So pre-COVID, our plan was to do one set of deliberations online, which is what we did last year, and then run the poll face-to-face this year in June, although obviously that couldn't happen. So now somewhat, I don't know if it's helpful or unhelpful, but we now have got the opportunity to compare kind of both outcomes, but also running in exactly the same methodological framework, which I think will help us interpret those outcomes. That second poll was only run early this month, so we don't yet know. We are looking at the data to see what that means for outcomes. But it's relatively rare, I think, to find examples of deliberations which have run on the same issue. And I think it's certainly something that I'm very keen to continue exploring, because there is a bit of a gap there in trying to understand that, and in doing so kind of contributing to the evidence base around what might be working or not working in terms of being able to effectively repeat process, but also to repeat outcome. I mean, I think that it's a little bit tricky because it starts to move into territory around kind of quantification, I think, a little more, or thinking about running processes which are held to similar standards around kind of outcome, efficacy and robustness, which are put on more kind of survey-based methods. And I think, you know, there are some methodological questions which I think deliberative scholars and others could really get hold of around what the balance in all of that is, you know, so we're not kind of moving, you know, we're not kind of abandoning it to utter subjectivity and saying, well, there you go, context is everything, although that basically should be the title of anything I ever write, because it's normally my conclusion, you know, through to actually, are there opportunities around what we know about testing deliberative principles and frameworks and systems such that they could be more reliably used potentially. The only other thought I'd have on that is something that you picked up on earlier, Graham, around, you know, can outcomes influence everyone else? And it may well be that if you're giving the power to a certainly constituted group of citizens, you can't predict their outcome. And indeed, it may be entirely valid and legitimate that it's different to somebody else's. So I think there's a range of different interrelated factors there. But in terms of our own work, hopefully in the next couple of months, we'll be able to take a view on whether repeat process equals repeat outcome. And I think that that's a really rich area for development personally, in terms of really advancing and pushing forward work of that type.
Okay, thanks. Marta, did you have anything on this? No, that's fine.
No,
so,
I actually... Sorry, can you hear me now? I have the internet connection and mute problem. Great. I did wanted to add actually something. I want to say, like, I also didn't hear about repeated citizens assembly or other innovations. There might be though. I wanted just to second Kerry. Absolutely, there's so much richness to actually emphasize and do something like that, especially for comparative analysis. And just hypothetically, I was thinking when Kerry was saying that, yeah, actually it's quite interesting because the results could be potentially different because of different people being involved. So despite that, like in the end, those events would be very much based on how people deliberate. It's not like they have pre-existing agenda or that moderators lead towards one direction. So it's actually very likely that the results would be different, or reasons which would be involved would be different. So I think there is, I'm very looking forward for some repeated events in terms of comparison and learning lessons. One of the problems with repeating events like that would be that they might lose a little bit of legitimacy as a result, and might be a bit more difficult to convince participants, because why to engage in a process which is not so significant, or just its comparative process. But yeah, those are very interesting bit more academic questions. So thank you for that as well.
Okay, great. Hopefully we'll be able to squeeze a couple more in if we go quick. So from Nathan Young, if citizens' assemblies became important, political parties would seek to manipulate them. Surely this would rob them of much of their value. Any thoughts from the panel? Graham?
Yes, they would. And therefore they've got to be absolutely watertight, rather like elections. We're getting massive lessons in the UK, but even bigger ones in the United States, on how the most ethical and pristine and admirable parts of democracy can be corrupted. Yes, that of course is a question. As far as I know, that is incredibly rare. I can't think of examples off the top of my head in the hundreds of deliberations that have taken place, and we must be very, very vigilant to make sure that doesn't happen. So that's why there's some fantastic people at each level who are service providers in this process, whether they're people who send out the initial letter to people from, let's say, a sample of all the electoral registers in the UK, and what that letter looks like, who can access that, who can access the results. Tremendous Peter McLeod works with us at the Citizens Convention on UK Democracy and a number of other expert people in the field. Brilliant people doing facilitation, making sure, and this is part of Andrew Blick's role, as it were, in thinking about this for us all the way through, about how you get good information to people that is impartial. It sounds very easy to do that, but it's actually really, really difficult. But you have to do it, because if you pollute this in any shape or form, then you undermine its legitimacy, and you not only undermine the legitimacy of this technique, you actually undermine the legitimacy of our democracy, as we've seen now with Cambridge Analytica and the Facebook stuff, which we need to get pretty sorted out pretty damn quickly, otherwise the whole thing will collapse. So it's very important to be vigilant about this. It's an important question that has to be answered every day that you go to work on an issue like this. So now I think this is probably harder to tamper with than what has become almost acceptable practice in terms of tampering with the other parts of our democracy, whether it's lobbying or whether it's voter suppression, whether it's direct access to government or whatever it may be. So we've got to, I know we're at the beginning of this, so we've got to, relatively at the beginning anyway, we've got a relatively clean slate. Let's keep it clean, absolutely.
Okay, and thanks guys. So we're going to fit in one more question. I have two questions with exactly the same number of votes. My apologies. One of them came in earlier than the other, and I think that's how I'm going to determine which I'm going to choose. So apologies, Laurie, don't hate me for this. We have an anonymous questioner who asks us, the House of Lords could use a sortition system, and I think we'll take this as meaning to determine who sits in the House of Lords. What would the issues with this be? Graham.
Let the people decide through a deliberative democratic process.
Any other thoughts? Marta.
Yeah, I also think actually that's a very good question. What would be the issues with that? In principle, I think that's a very interesting way to go forward. Why not have sortitions or based second chamber or first chamber based on people who comes from ordinary citizens, not from certain elites? Why we cannot have much more democratic way of decision making? But just as Grant said, it's just one of the way of democratizing or making more participatory or more embedded or deeper democratic system within the UK. There might be also others which might be better, taking into consideration the historical tradition of the UK. As a result, I think actually this might move to the further sort of decision and thinking why not or why yes to the public. Just because the parliament is somehow representative, it's not only one of the additional, basically it's a symbol, it's not only one of the additional democratic innovation, and I think here symbolic consequences could be also quite important for the public. So yeah.
Okay, thanks very much, guys. Time's against us. We have had a really good long time for discussion. It falls to me just to send a couple of quick thanks. First of all to Jamie Cassoon, who you won't have seen, who's been tirelessly working in the background organising the AV side. Thank you, Jamie. Particularly to Alex Mortimer, who has been organising and administrating this whole event and generally does tireless work for Centre for British Politics and Government and DPE in general. So thank you, Alex. Thank you to all three of our speakers, Graham, Kerry and Marta, and particularly thank you to all of you for your questions. We haven't been able to go through them all. We will be reading them. If you want to get in touch with us and follow up directly, you can do that through the centre. That's absolutely fine. We'd be happy to follow up on those too. We will be having some other events coming up, so watch this space, watch our social media, and look at the centre's website for information on further events later on before the end of the year. Thank you, everybody. And yeah.